and then we'll be broadcasting. I just want to wait a second to make sure the connection is good for the public. Okay, all set. So good evening. My name is Andy Port. I'm the Director of Planning and Development for the City of Newburyport. I'm the Zoom host and meeting moderator for tonight. With us tonight, we have Jody Vining, who's the Senior Project Manager for the City of Newburyport, Liz Altman and Lauria Ho from TEC, and they are going to be presenting the Parker Street Shared Use Path. It's an informational meeting, and if folks have questions, as shown on the screen, you can use Zoom's raise hand feature, and after the overview of the project, we'll take questions from the audience. So with that, I'll just pass it to Jordy.
Okay, sounds good. Andy's going to pull up a context map of the downtown and the Clipper City Rail Trail, just so that we can get oriented on this project. So many of you are probably familiar with this long-running, long-range project that the city's been working on for about 2 decades. So in this image that shows sort of the basic outline of the path, phase 1 over there on the left side of the screen in the north end, that was done in 2010. And then the portion going along the riverfront and the central waterfront, and then the phase 2 trail that was done a couple years ago. We still have the riverfront gap at the wastewater treatment facility up there. And then coming down to Parker Street at the bottom of the screen, and we've circled the piece of territory that we're working on in this project, the Parker Street Shared Use Pathway and the State Street intersection there. And just while we have this image up, I think it's important to note that so-called phase 3 of the rail trail is really divided into several different smaller projects because of the varying jurisdiction and so forth associated. So what we're primarily going to be talking about tonight is the municipal project, the City of Newburyport current project, which is working to institute a safe crossing of State Street there at the Parker Street intersection between the courthouse and the True Value corner, and about 500 feet of the shared use pathway off of the road on the northern edge of the right-of-way of Parker Street. I will touch on a couple of adjacent projects so people have some sense of how these things are going to link up. But very briefly, on the left of the screen, to the west is essentially Mass DOT territory with Route 1 and the Rotary. And so I'll show you the concept plan that they have for an adjacent project to get people across Route 1 and over to where we have a 10-foot wide sidewalk along Parker Street back to the phase 1 trail. And over on the right, on the east, you can see the pond back there. The Eddie Hill is a developer who's been developing the Parker Hill project there. And part of a special condition of his project is building another 500 feet of this pathway up to the town line, up to the cemetery entrance, essentially. And then there's just a couple hundred feet left in the town of Newberry. So that's how that breaks out. Andy, if perhaps you could go to the aerial photo base image showing the plan of this project. And I'll just try to talk through this, and then we can pop briefly to those other adjacent projects and then move to Q&A. So what we're looking at here is Parker Street and State Street as they're labeled there. You see the roof of True Value on the sort of the top of the screen there, in the parking area for True Value, and sort of a corner of the courthouse over on the other side. This project is, and also outlined is the public right-of-way. The Parker Street public right-of-way, which is considerably broader than the actual paved part of the street, which essentially allows us to insert this 10-foot wide paved pathway, rail trail, shared use path on the northern side of the road. We're going pretty much right up to the edge of the public right-of-way. We're going on the inside of the existing utility poles that are along there. So there's going to be a little bit of a buffer between the trail and the road and the motor vehicles on Parker Street. There's also going to be a timber guardrail running along the middle of that sort of grass buffer. So there's going to be an additional sense of separation between the bicyclists and the pedestrians and the trail users on the one side and the vehicles on the other. Starting over on the right-hand side of the screen, there's there's a crosswalk there crossing over the entrance to Shepherd's Auto. And that's where the connection will be to Ed Hill's project. Continuing to the west, to the left, the project is going to, off the road, is going to go through a wetland area along the edge of the road, an existing swale with phragmites and so forth. There's no other place to put the trail other than along here. It's a somewhat low quality wetland based on all these invasive species. We're looking to replicate on a one-to-one basis the wetland area across the street there, again within the municipal right-of-way. So that's what those hatch marks are on that side. There's one point where we'll have the path be narrowed down to 8 feet wide as we put in head walls and so forth to allow for the hydrological connection of that wetland and going into the pipes that exist going underneath the road to the wetland on the other side. Continuing on to the east, the 10-foot wide paved trail, there'll be a driveway entrance for sort of a future connection for the True Value property, and a replaced fence at that point. And then the trail is going to be going along essentially next to the building. At first, it's just grass, existing grass, and then it's all paved. I've been working with Pete Kelly and his daughters for a few months now. They're pretty supportive of the project. They understand that the employee parking, which they've sort of informally used on that side of the building. The cars were always on or at least half of them on the municipal right-of-way. So they understand that that's going away. That pavement's going to be taken up. It's going to be grass put back, and what we're showing is some shrubs along the edge of the building there. So the pathway bends a little bit as it starts going past the building because we have to get by one of these utility poles, and then it carries on over to the street, the State Street corner. The curbing is being bumped out. Right now, as I think probably everybody knows, there's no pedestrian or bicycle or any kind of accommodations. It's just motor vehicles zipping through this intersection. So this approach here does the sort of typical complete streets approach of trying to make this safer on a number of counts for pedestrians crossing. The curbing is being bumped out so that there is a narrower crossing. People aren't exposed in the road for as far. We have to redo some of the catch basins and some of the drainage to accommodate that. There's going to be a painted crosswalk, and there's also going to be a pedestrian activated signal. So I think what we're moving towards is a so-called hawk signal that's growing in popularity. That's maybe not quite the right word, but is growing increased prevalence. We have a photo of it which I'll show you in a bit, but basically it's a mast arm that goes out there. There's the photo, that's from Newton, and it goes from dark to yellow and then red when the pedestrian pushes the button. So going back to the plan, I'll just sort of finish discussing how that works. So crosses over to the other side, to where the courthouse side is, and then we're setting up essentially a crossing of the Parker Street right of way that goes through the courthouse, but that's where the project will stop. Eventually, the Mass DOT is going to be putting in the crosswalk there and the handicapped, the curb cut and handicap ramp and landing and so forth, as they continue the walkway to the south there. Andy, actually, if you could pull up the HSH MassDOT concept plan, that's probably a good segue so people can get a broader sense of where all this is going. We've been talking with MassDOT, Department of Transportation, for many years. Andy, there we go, perfect. So if you look down towards the bottom of the screen, you can see the outline of the city's project. Andy's blowing it up right now. And then there's a crossing of Parker Street, and then the pathway going along essentially the edge of the Rotary next to the restaurant plaza there. This is all within the state right of way. I think they're shifting over the center of the island a bit, and doing pavement markings to identify lanes and turning lanes and so forth. As I was just trying to say, we in the city have been talking with the state about the Rotary for many, many years, and had advocated certain ways that we thought was going to be the safest to try to get across Route 1. MassDOT ended up hiring their own traffic consultant and engineering consultant, and this is a concept that they analyzed and recommended that they follow. There's plenty of other options out there, but they're either too expensive for the state to support a multi-million-dollar project, such as turning this into a roundabout or a T intersection or something like that. But this is what the state is sort of willing and able to do. This project is probably a year or so behind ours. They're at the early stage, the concept stage, the survey stage, whereas we are at the sort of 50% design and into our permitting. Just to finish my quick monologue about this concept plan, again, this isn't our project, but we're working with the state as they start to develop it. But this will bring the pathway with a little green buffer along the edge of the northern edge of that Rotary, and then crossing right essentially at the restaurant, crossing right to the north of the Rotary. One thing, Matt, there's going to be the hawk signals, so the pedestrian activated hawk signals on either side, plus in the middle, for people to get across there. And getting across to a new sidewalk, which will then carry folks back to Parker Street, where the city already built that 10-foot wide sidewalk, which carries one back to the Phase 1 rail trail. So that, in a nutshell, is that's where Andy's circling right there. In a nutshell, that's what the state is planning on doing. It's a numbered project as part of a broader Route 1 repaving and so forth, and we'll be following along with them as they move with that process. Eventually, they'll probably have a 25% design hearing about that, but there's some ways off, some months off from that. Andy, if you don't mind flipping over to the Ed Hill, Parker Hill plan, we can sort of briefly show that, and then move towards questions and answers. So this plan over on the left is Shepherd's Auto, all the way to the far side of the plan there. So we're picking up where our project is ending. And Ed Hill's project does essentially the same thing, a 10-foot wide shared use path, paved shared use path that's slipped in on the inside of the utility poles up in the along the edge of the public right-of-way. And they've already done their permitting for this. This is a draft plan. We don't, I haven't talked with Ed Hill for a few months now. I'll have to see where he's at given the pandemic and whether he was able to keep working on the housing units back there. So we're not quite sure what his time frame is at this point, but our time frame is that our project is presumably going to be first, and we have a complete streets grant that we secured for construction, and we are about to go in front of the Conservation Commission with our notice of intent for an order of conditions, and we hope to be finished with design as well as permitting this summer, and pre-order that mast arm, which takes a fairly long time to manufacture, and be able to bid this project out and get the construction started in the early fall. So that's sort of the basic time frame here. And maybe with that, I'll stop talking. Liz and Lori, is there anything else you want to add before we open it up for questions?
Hi, Joy. This is Lori Al calling. I don't believe I have anything to add at this time. Just want to thank the city for allowing us to work with you on this wonderful project. I think it's going to look great when it's completed, and it's going to be a big safety improvement over what you have for an existing condition out there today.
Very good. Liz, anything to add before we open it up?
No, thank you. That was a great summary.
Okay, very good. Hopefully I didn't talk too long and covered the bases as much as possible. Andy, do you want to see if anyone has any questions for us at this point?
Sure, yeah. So this is Andy. If folks in the audience, I see we have about maybe 18 folks in the audience. If any of you are interested in asking a question or expressing any concern about the project, just use Zoom's raise hand feature and we'll call on you. Looks like you've done a very good job presenting, Jordy, because nobody seems to have any questions.
As people, I would
like
add that, well, if people are thinking of their questions, I am always available over email, and and I have been answering people's individual questions about this project. So certainly after the informational meeting, I'll always be available to touch base about this.
Okay, it looks like we do have a few questions. So the first person we have is identified as Zimi. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask any questions, or.
I just want to say the plan looks really good. Looks really good. The pedestrian and the bicyclers need to be able to cross State Street, and it looks like a great plan. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for that comment.
You told me come down the other rail trail to the Parker Trail. No, I'm not going to do that. You could have done it.
Okay, the next person we have is Linda Landry.
Okay. Hi there. I'm very excited about this plan and being able to cross State Street. Can you remind me what you said about the other piece that's connecting to the rail trail phase 2? The additional part along Parker Street. How long is that expected to take?
Excuse me, Linda. Are you talking about the piece to the east, to the right, that Ed Hill is doing? Is that the piece you're talking about?
Yes, Ed Hill. I'm not familiar with who that is, or
right.
That place. Yes, all the way.
So Andy circled it there. So the for the past couple of years, there's a project which ultimately I think is going to have 22, 23 units of housing that's been going back in there up towards that pond. And as part of a special permit condition of his was, once he gets to a certain level of building and occupancy and so forth, that he needs to build this this segment of rail trail. He's a big supporter of the rail trail. The Phase 1 rail trail goes by one of his projects off of Washington Street there. So he's been good to work with about this. In terms of the time frame, the permit condition does not require him to do it now or necessarily anytime terribly soon. He's still, there's a couple of, one can see as one goes by there, the existing buildings off of Hines Way and near Parker Street, and he's been working his way back there with the other buildings. So he had indicated to Andy and me that he was looking to build this before he legally had to. The pandemic and the sort of changing economic conditions may have changed that time frame. So as I think I mentioned, I have an email into him recently just to check in with him and ask about his time frame. But he had originally said last fall that he was hoping to do it this year, 2020. We'll have to see whether he's able to do that financially or whether he's going to bump that potentially to next year. That's what we know at this point about that project. I would also note that continuing the last couple hundred feet in Newberry, that we have been talking with the town officials as well as the Coastal Trails Coalition about Mass Trails grants that are available to help them work towards closing the loop on that end.
Okay, great. Great, that's really helpful. Excellent presentation, thanks.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Zima, did you have another question? I see your hand is still raised. Wasn't sure if that's an additional question. That's probably not. Does anybody else have any questions in the audience or comments?
There looks like there's 2 questions in the chat.
The first one says, I joined a little late. Did they provide an estimated timeline? So the each of these sort of pieces of the puzzle is on a different time frame. At this point, our project, the municipal project, appears to be on track to complete permitting and design this summer, and then and bidding the project out and starting construction in the fall. There's a little bit of a wild card in terms of how long the mast arm will take to manufacture, but are potentially a little ambitious, but our goal is to try to finish that this calendar year. My guess is that the Ed Hill piece is the Parker Hill project is going to probably be next year, although we need to confirm where he's at on that piece. He's well along in his permitting and design, so that's probably more a matter of financial wherewithal, given what's happened to the economy and so forth. The town of Newbury piece is a little behind that in terms of just being a line on a line drawing essentially, but we have had some meetings and some discussions for them to potentially seek funding for design and then construction from the state in the next round of Mass Trails funding for next year. And then finally, over on the left with the Route 1 MassDOT project, that project at this point is considered an advertisement FY21 project, so next fiscal year. If that doesn't change, that probably means that they work through their design and all their process and bid the project out in a year or so from now. So again, their construction would probably be as much as at least a year and perhaps 2 years away. So that's the basic timeframes on that scale. The other question there was, will the town of Newbury make any connection on the Parker Street Trail? And the questioner might have already heard me say this, but we have been had a couple of meetings and discussions in recent weeks and months, in particular, with the town of Newbury, various officials there, and volunteers, as well as the Coastal Trails Coalition, the nonprofit advocacy group for our region, and there is a discussion and a game plan, and even some sort of ballpark cost estimates and framework of a project there. That's on a somewhat different time frame, but I'm reasonably confident that we'll all be able to push along on that piece.
The next question we have is from Councilor Khan, or comment?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Hello, thank you for that presentation, Jordy. I did come like maybe 5 minutes into this too late, so I don't know if you already covered this, but I guess on the question regarding the having the pedestrian signal, and in terms of the aesthetics or the type of device being used, I think you called it was it an eagle something, but is that gonna,
Sorry.
is that gonna be, is that like solar? Do you know if that's going to be requiring wiring, or are you going to be using any type of efficiency, renewable type of power with solar, or is that already kind of defined and designed? And who does, I think that's the team that's on the call as well, that's part of that design.
Let me push that over to Liz Altman of TEC.
It's a hardwired cabinet, just like a regular traffic signal.
And then the other question, and that's pretty much set, right? That's definitive. And is that something that's just already defined by the grant process, or what the aspects of the grant that are covered? Is that how that works?
That is fairly defined. Liz, maybe you just want to give a quick overview of what's the MUTCD guidelines and requirements and legal liability and what's feasible and not feasible for a pedestrian activated crossing, and what's warranted, et cetera.
Sure. My name is Liz Altman. I'm a traffic planner with TEC, and we've been working with the city on this project. The federal guidelines that we go by for designing traffic signals and control of traffic are pretty well defined. They're in a document called it's a book, it's huge. The Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, we call it the MUTCD. And they give us some very strict guidelines on what we can and can't place for signalized or pedestrian crossings. So we went and looked at the speed of vehicles on State Street, the volume of vehicles, and really focusing on how to get pedestrians across State Street safely and efficiently. And due to the speeds of the vehicles coming off of the rotary and the volume of vehicles and the potential conflicts for the pedestrians, this hawk is what is recommended to be installed. They are popping up all over the state at rail trail endings, as more and more rail trails and shared use paths are being constructed throughout the state. This is a very optimal way to get pedestrians and bicyclists across a busier street.
Great, thank you. And is it sound activated as well for those that cannot?
Yes, it has the same pedestrian push buttons that are audible as a regular traffic signal.
And then my other question, I think you kind of hit on it, and then I'll be done, is Jordy also showed kind of the other portion, which is going to be covered by the state to do in terms of the crosswalk. And you mentioned that you guys did study the traffic flow on state and the speeds, which is, it is pretty fast. Is that kind of the extent of like a traffic study, or will something else be triggered to do that, given the number of crosswalks that will be there at some point? I was just asking the planning department more about that, if that is going to be warranted or provided to the city. Thank you.
Oh, as far as the crossing on Route 1, I would believe that their consultant would be working with the state on their warrants for that crossing.
I will add, yeah, HSH, Howardstown Hudson, which is the state's traffic engineer on that project, they did a fairly substantial analysis and study of speeds and volumes and turning movements. So they analyzed sort of every turn, every intersection of the whole rotary area. And in a somewhat similar fashion to our analysis of State Street, there's a spectrum from having nothing for a pedestrian to activate to cross over, to an RRFB, those beacons that we have in a couple of spots on Low Street and Merrimack Street, the flashing beacons, and which we're going to be putting up on several crosswalks on High Street as part of the Safe Routes to Schools. And then the hawk signal, which is is a bigger and more visible system. So MassDOT they started out thinking of using the beacons, but have moved towards using the hawk signals for the crossing of Route 1, as it's much more visible and much more controlling of the traffic. I did ask recently Brian Fallon, the Mass DOT project manager, about those turning movement counts, which are from about 2 years ago, I believe. And he said that at this point, the state has an engineering directive not to go out and do more of those, as the traffic patterns are abnormal right now, given the pandemic and the shutdown of restaurants and businesses. And so it's a bit of an open question of whether they will do additional studies as their project goes along, but they do have a substantial basis for that project, with hundreds of pages of information that they collected when they were studying the volumes and speeds and accident history and turning movements.
Great, thank you.
Jordy, I would add one other thing about that. I know you and I have been working on parts of this project for a while. And one thing was that we had been early on in this project, we had been talking about crossing with the old Parker Street right-of-way, more direct route, if you will. And there's pros and cons to different approaches, but the primary reason that it's shifted over is because Mass DOT felt much more comfortable with the crossing in a place where it would be visible to the public as they're driving up through the rotary and taking a right there by the restaurant. So this, by bringing it closer to the intersection, it's in a line of sight essentially for those folks, as opposed to if it was where I've drawn that oval there. That would have been a direct route for the bike path, but it would have potentially put folks in a less safe situation because vehicles might had the advanced visual cue to slow down, since they would now see the signal as they're coming through the rotary even.
Right. Yeah. And just to add quickly to that, the MassDOT and HSH felt that vehicles accelerate as they're coming northbound out of the rotary there, and that would potentially conflict with a crossing there. The city had advocated for that because we thought that made sense from the pedestrian and bicyclist perspective, but it is a balancing act. And MassDOT is the one that controls Route 1 and that property. And basically we had a couple of years of going back and forth with them on suggested options of getting across, and this is where they settled on.
And I don't see any other questions from the audience at this time. Oh, it looks like we do have one more. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is kind of an unrelated question, but can you describe what's happening at the end of Bromfield Street along Joppa, where the trail kind of stops and just goes along Water Street there?
Oh, okay. Andy, maybe you want to pull back that context map of the whole Clipper City Rail Trail. Yeah, so this meeting is obviously focused on the this Parker Street gap that we're working on, and we'll be bidding out separately. The portion that I believe you're talking about is the riverfront section between Joppa Park up there on the right, and going behind the wastewater treatment facility over to the American Yacht Club.
Correct. Yep.
So
You know?
there's a nice, long, complicated history with this, but basically we that portion of the rail trail was designed and permitted along with the rest of the 1.5 mile phase 2 project. However, there were two big stumbling blocks once the state hired the contractor and mobilized to the scene. One was that that PCBs were discovered back there, and we've had a long-running process of cleaning up back there. We've had 2 rounds of excavation and then transport and out-of-state disposal of PCB contaminated soils. We are getting fairly close. Our LSP licensed site professional recently had a conference with regulatory authorities, state and DEP. And our argument has been that because there's underground electric lines which run along that corridor, we're getting very close to them in terms of the excavation, and that it is not safe to keep going. And he's pulled up a drone shot of that corridor. So the EPA and the DEP have asked us for lots and lots of information, and we have to do some more sampling and delineation to show them that that the extent of the contaminated portion has been covered, and as well as some other things. But we believe we're pretty close with the that rail corridor portion. We do have a little bit more work to do because a portion of this PCB contaminated soil is on the other side of the fence inside the wastewater treatment facility proper. It's all part of the same thing, but so we have to do a little bit more work there to delineate it and then get the crew back in to excavate and dispose of that soil. That's a smaller area. And the hope is we were a little overly optimistic, I guess, in terms of what we were going to find once we actually got the shovels into the ground. We had hoped this was only going to take a couple of months once we finally were able to dig. That has not proven to be the case, and working with the regulatory authorities has been somewhat laborious. But the idea is that we are going to be able to close out that riverfront section, bring in 2 feet of backfill on top of the old soil, along with several other things, a geotextile separating the soils, and a legal so-called activity and use limitation. And then we'll be able to open up those gates for informal use, back to sort of informal access back there, as people, used to be able to do for years. And in the meantime, we're working on the design and permitting and funding of the of rebuilding that project. The city decided, instead of simply rebuilding the trail as originally permitted and designed, because the state contractor was ready to do that, was that there was significant erosion in this area about 2 years ago with some big storms. and the erosion actually was cutting right across the old rail corridor up to the fence. And there was a concern that spending money and building that trail facility, it would be vulnerable to storm surge and eventually sea level rise and erosion. And we've also realized in recent years, or it's grown increasingly salient, that the wastewater treatment facility, which is critical infrastructure for our community, as well as for a good portion of Newbury, is vulnerable to storm surge. It's well below the base flood elevation currently, and then that's only going to get worse in coming years. So we have essentially a new project that's been is under design and getting revised permits and new permits to build that area up. Originally, we're only going to bring in like a foot or so of fill. Now we're talking about 4 or 5 feet of fill. So they're creating a berm as well as a slope stone revetment all along that portion. You can see the stone there. There used to be a stone revetment when the railroad was built in 1872, and then in the early 20th century, that is largely unraveled and does not work anymore. So we're looking to rebuild that. That whole project, I'm trying to be succinct here. It's a complicated history. We're pretty far down the road with design and redesign and re-permitting of that project. We have a couple of paths we're trying to sort of keep open simultaneously for construction funding. One is seeking a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant from the state to fund the bulk of the construction of this facility. That would be the quickest route to building it. The plan B is to go back and use the federal transportation funding, which is what we use to build phase 1 and phase 2 of the rail trail. And we've gotten positive signals about both of those efforts, or both of those sources. One never knows quite how that'll play out. So right now we're sort of pursuing them both simultaneously, and then seeing which one is going to work the best. So we're certainly we're hoping that this year that corridor will be reopened to informal use, and we can get bikes and pedestrians off of Water Street and back, at least informally, going along here on a dirt surface. And then hopefully, as the rest of this thing comes together in the next year or two, we'll have the formal trail built.
That would be great. It sounds really good. And I just want to thank you again for the crossing down at Parker Street and State Street. It really looks good.
Great.
You live on the trail. Yeah, you're not going to do that, are you? No.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments from the audience? Okay, I guess not.
Thank you for coming, everybody. As I said, if you have any other additional questions, just contact me in the planning office. We'll try to put information up on the website and do press releases as we sort of advance the project in the coming weeks and months.
Thanks, Jody.
All right. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Liz and Lori from TEC.
Thank you, Jordy. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone.